I know that some of you were already wondering when I would produce a video about Forest Lodge in Windsor, which is to become the new home of the Prince and Princess of Wales and their family just before Christmas. It has been a week now since the news broke that they would be moving there, and I've kept you waiting. Now, I thought a video on this very pleasant Georgian country house would be a simple matter, but you know me by now. I don't do simple, and in the end the work involved a deep dive into the history of this place and its fascinating and compelling array of past inhabitants. But before I begin to tell the story of Forest Lodge, let's first get our bearings a bit and look at its geographical location. It is halfway down and on the very western edge of Windsor Great Park, close to the forest of Cranbourne Chase, and it sits between the village that houses all the Windsor estate workers, the park's York Cricket Club, and the A332, which is the road between Windsor and Ascot. It's also in a very convenient location if you want to get to Lambrook School, which is where the Wales's children are being educated. It's 10 minutes door to door. It's also not all that far from Royal Lodge, the home of Prince Andrew, not that this is a motivating factor, and it's also close to Cumberland Lodge and Fort Belvedere. And indeed, there is a direct connection between the two houses. For Sir Malcolm Murray, who had lived in Fort Belvedere before Edward VIII took up residence in 1929, moved from there to Forest Lodge in that year when he took up the post of Deputy Ranger of Windsor Great Park. It was then the Deputy Ranger's official residence. Until 1936, the house was in fact known as Holly Grove House, and from its construction in the 1770s until 1829, it was a private residence. It was then outside the boundaries of Windsor Great Park and was not part of the Crown estate at all. Indeed, if you look at this map from 1899, that funny little ridge to the north of the house is the medieval boundary that marked the extent of Windsor Great Park until 1829. The present house was constructed sometime between 1772 and 1782 on the site of a pre-existing cottage. For this man, Colonel John Deaken, who is the groom of the bedchamber to Henry Frederick, Duke of Cumberland, the brother of King George III. Deakin was Cumberland's right-hand man, and he held that post from 1767 until 1790 when the Duke died. The construction of Holly Grove allowed Deakin some comfort while being close at hand to the Duke. The house is thought to have been designed by Thomas Sandby, who at the time of its construction was the Deputy Ranger of Windsor Great Park. He was the Duke of Cumberland's assistant. We encountered him in the last video on Fort Belvedere, as he was responsible for some of the garden buildings surrounding Virginia Water. This is Sandby's initial proposal for the main south elevation of Holly Grove House. It remains in the collection of the British Museum. It is labelled, as you will see, a design for Colonel Deaken's house in Windsor Forest. The house is completed, and as it more or less remains today, followed the main massing that was outlined in this design, but it had rather simpler decorative details. The house consists of a square central block that is 3 bays wide and is of 3 stories. In the main block there are 4 rooms on each floor, 2 at the front and 2 at the back. This main block is then flanked by 2 projecting wings, which were single-storey until the 19th century, which contain a kitchen on one side and a main reception room on the other side. The ground floor rooms on the south front are lit by 4 identical windows known as Venetian windows. These appear on Sandby's design for the main block, but the 2 pavilion windows in his design are rather more elaborate in design. When it came to construction, it clearly seemed easier just to repeat this design for the fenestration across the whole of the front. Sandby's design also has a front porch sheltering the central door, but this doesn't appear to have ever been constructed. His design also shows windows with elaborate stone surrounds, which again were omitted for a plainer version of the same. The primary decoration of the south front as executed takes the form of 4 tall pilasters, and these are not on Sandby's original drawing. There is no surviving design for the north front, the back of the house facing the garden. It has a very plain facade with canted projecting bays. The window frames are all plain. The whole facade doesn't appear to have been altered since it was constructed in the 1770s. I can't find out with any precision when Colonel Deaken sold the house. It was probably shortly after his master the Duke died. By 1792 he was certainly no longer living there, and it was in the possession of a Lady Anne Jennings Clark. She was the widow of Sir Philip Jennings, known as Jennings Clark after 1774, who was a former colonel in the Horse Guards and an MP, and had been given a baronetcy in 1774. Lady Jennings Clark was a very wealthy woman, for not only did she hold the extensive properties of her late husband for her life, but she was also the co-heiress of her father, Colonel Richard Thompson, the former MP for Reading. She had, among other estates, extensive lands in Hampshire and in Shropshire, and interests in sugar plantations in St Thomas's Parish in Jamaica. Why Lady Jennings Clark bought the house rather than settling on her other estates is unclear. She was already in the 1790s and her 60s, but she clearly intended to settle there, for in 1796 she commissioned Humphrey Repton, a very well-known landscape designer, to produce plans for the improvement of the gardens. Now, Humphrey Repton was in many respects the successor of Capability Brown, the principal exponent of the English landscape garden style, and it is likely that part of Repton's remit was the landscaping of the 50 acres of parkland that surrounded the house. If you look at this aerial photograph of the house and its surroundings, you'll notice at the top a label that reads Battleborn. This is the name of a stream that runs through this part of the Windsor landscape. At this point it runs through a series of man-made ponds. Now this is just the sort of picturesque feature that Repton would have included in his landscaping and is probably part of his work. Repton also constructed a walled kitchen garden beside the house, which was set in the middle of a flower garden and pretty wilderness, and this wall garden is still extant. Repton brought in W.T. Ayton, the superintendent of Kew Gardens, who designed and executed this lovely greenhouse and peach house so that Lady Jennings Clark could have a supply of exotic soft fruit. Sadly, this greenhouse no longer appears to remain, but it was still there in 1899, just next to the walled kitchen garden, as it appears on the Ordnance Survey map of that year. It had gone by 1910. Repton also made suggestions for the improvement of the house itself, and this drawing is of his proposal for the adornment of the south facade of the house. The design is quite something. It appears that the 1770s house was to be entirely retained, but a narrow extension was to be added to the facade, which would have provided a new entrance hall and flanking pavilions. This extension was to have trellises up it, and it was to be embellished in the Chinese taste. Now, chinoiserie was all the rage in the 1790s, and the new pavilions and even the main block of the house were to be given pagoda-like roofs with little dangly bells hanging from the eaves. The main roof was to be topped with a gigantic pineapple. It is such a pity that this rather bonkers design by Repton didn't come about, as it would have transformed what is a fairly pedestrian Georgian building into something that was rather more playful. Lady Jennings Clark died in 1798, which probably explains why Repton's alterations to the house didn't go ahead. She had 4 children, 2 sons, Charles and John, and 2 daughters, Anne and Frances. But by 1798, only Frances Jennings, her younger daughter, was alive, and Hollygrove would pass to her. Frances had long been living with her mother in the house. Also living with Lady Jennings Clark was her orphan granddaughter Frances Duncombe, Anne's daughter, her only other living relation. Now we know that the 3 ladies were all living together in 1794 thanks to the diary of Queen Charlotte. She visited Lady Jennings Clark on April the 29th, 1794, and found them all living there, and they had a walk around the garden for a few hours together. Miss Frances Jennings sold Hollygrove House in 1803 to a man called Spencer Mackay. He was a man of independent means. He didn't need to work, his income coming principally from the ownership of extensive plantations and slaves in Guyana. Mackay's tenure of the house was to be brief, and he sold the property in 1807. The person who bought the property from Mackay was a gentleman called Theodore Broadhead. Theodore was a moderately wealthy gentleman. His father, also confusingly called Theodore, we'll call the two men senior and junior, had inherited an estate at Monkbretton near Barnsley in Yorkshire from his maternal grandfather. He had changed his name then to Broadhead from Brinkman in order to inherit that estate, and perhaps also to cover up his roots, as his grandfather, Theodore Brinkman, was a servant in the household of George I and had come to England from Hanover in 1714. The Broadheads were very ambitious men. Theodore Senior tried to purchase a baronetcy, a hereditary knighthood, and a seat in Parliament, but without success, and he died in 1810. His son was equally ambitious, but rather more successful. Theodore Jr. had purchased a commission in the Life Guards, and his acquisition in 1807 of Hollygrove House from Mackay was without question part of a calculated scheme to rise further up the social ladder. It paid off, it seems, for he was able to purchase himself a pocket borough and sit as an MP from 1812. In 1797, Theodore Jr. had married Elizabeth MacDougall, and at his death in 1820, Hollygrove House then became her property. And this is what the house looked like in 1823 during Mrs. Broadhead's tenure. It was approached through an avenue of trees with Virginia creeper climbing up the brick walls. Now you'll notice that by 1823 the two side wings of the house have acquired upper stories. These appear to have been added some time in the 20 years before this drawing was made. The house has very little changed externally since 1823. It was Mrs. Broadhead who sold Hollygrove House in 1829 with 50 acres of beautifully timbered pasture land to the Crown Estate, and it then became part of Windsor Great Park. From 1830 until 1936, the house was used as the residence of the Deputy Ranger of Windsor Great Park. Sir William Fremantle, Deputy Ranger from 1830 until 1850, was the first to take up residence here, and Sir Malcolm Murray, who left in 1936, was the last. After the departure of Sir Malcolm Murray, the house is then let to a series of courtiers, firstly in 1936 to Sir John Aird, who was Edward VIII's equerry, and later an extra equerry to George VI and Elizabeth II. It was at Aird's suggestion in 1937 that the name of the house was changed from Hollygrove House to Forest Lodge. The house continued to be inhabited by Aird and his wife Lady Priscilla, the daughter of the second Earl of Ancaster, until his death in 1973. In 1975, the lease of the house was given to Nigel Lord Napier and Ettrick, who was the comptroller of the household and private secretary to Princess Margaret until 1998. When he and Lady Napier departed in 1998, a 20-year tenancy was then offered on the open market. However, the house wasn't let in that year, as by then it was badly in need of refurbishment. A major scheme of works was therefore undertaken in 2001, and it is from photos of that work then in progress that we can get a very tiny glimpse of the interior of the house. There are only 4 photographs. The first photograph is taken from the main south door of the house, down the entrance hall, looking towards the back of the house. This is a space that Colonel Deaken, the builder of the house in the 1770s, would have instantly recognised, as it is little changed since that time. It is quite a grand space. The outer hall has a very fine coffered ceiling supported on a classical entablature, while an arch flanked by 2 pairs of pilasters leads the eye through to the inner hallway. Although Sandby didn't get his way with a lavish exterior when he designed this house, evidently no expense was spared in creating a statement with this initial entrance space. Now you'll notice that there are 2 doors on either side of the hallway and 1 door straight ahead. This hallway connects through to 4 large reception rooms that are on the ground floor of the main block of the house. The second photograph is taken just through the right-hand doorway and is one of the front reception rooms that is painted a pretty yellow. Notice the Venetian window with its shutters, which shows that it looks out on that south front. There is a fairly simple marble fire surround here, which appears to be 18th century. Lady Jennings Clark and her daughter and granddaughter would have recognised this space, and you can imagine them taking tea with Queen Charlotte in this sunny south-facing parlour. The photograph we have is a rather frustrating image, as it gives just a hint that there might be a very fine plaster ceiling in this room, but all we see is a glimpse of the corner of it. Returning to the hallway, we're now going to go through the archway and then turn right, and that will take us to the staircase hall where the third photograph was taken. Behind the photographer is a passageway that leads through to the right-hand flanking wing, which I think contained the kitchen and the offices. The staircase appears to be from the 1770s, although I wonder if the side panelling on it has been messed around with at some stage. The plasterwork in this space is relatively simple, with only a moulded cornice. All the display in the interior of this house was seemingly invested in that first outer hallway. Directly ahead of us is a green painted reception room, which is the subject of the fourth photograph. It is one of the rooms that looks over the garden at the back, and you'll notice the window here is a bay window with shutters. This space appears to have been updated at some point in the 19th century. It has a 19th century dado around the interior of the room and a French-style pompadour fireplace of a sort that was all the rage in Paris in the 1830s and 40s. Was it put in by one of the deputy rangers? It might well have been, but is it just me, or is it just a little too blousy for an English classical context? Forest Lodge is a really lovely house, very spacious with a fascinating history, and it will make a superb family residence. It is Grade 2 listed, so hopefully it won't receive a recovation before the Walesers move in before Christmas. Thanks for watching. Thank you for all your support. If you enjoy my YouTube channel, don't forget that you can support my work further and help others see my content by liking, subscribing and sharing my videos.